Starbucks now says that anyone can use the restrooms in their stores, whether they make a purchase or not. The change comes in response to an incident last month when an employee at a Philadelphia branch called the police on two black men for using the restroom without making a purchase. The two men were not charged and settled with the city of Philadelphia for a symbolic $1 and another $200,000 toward a city program to help young entrepreneurs. They also settled with Starbucks for an undisclosed amount. Now, the coffee chain will also be closing its doors next Tuesday for what the company says is racial bias education. So here to talk more about Starbucks nationwide training is Dr. Tanisha Ford. She's an associate professor of Africana Studies and History at the University of Delaware and the author of Liberated Threads, Black Women's Style and the Global Politics of Soul. And I just wanted to point out something. They didn't actually get a chance to use the restroom. They were told that they couldn't, but they sat down and they were, the police were called on them because they were sitting and not purchasing, which is sort of a direct violation of Starbucks policy, which is what started this whole thing. So let's talk about this whole racial bias training. Starbucks is shutting down at tremendous cost to the company. I think it's 175,000 employees will undergo this training. Racial bias training, though, seems like something that doesn't have a clear definition. And the thing about a personal bias is it's hard to define, right? And it expresses itself in various ways. So what can we expect from racial bias training?
Well, first, let me start saying that these two young men in this Starbucks store experienced a trauma, right? That they were there for 2 minutes, 120 seconds before the police were called, before this manager decides to call the Philadelphia police into this Starbucks in this very ritzy area of the city, and have these men arrested and brought out of this store. Right. One of the gentlemen said that he felt like his life was in danger. He didn't know what would happen to him, if he would even make it home, because the police were now involved in this situation that for them seemed like, what? I mean, people come into Starbucks all the time without paying and sit down and wait for a person in their party to join them. So for me, when I hear Starbucks saying that we're going to shut down our stores for this racial bias training, they get no pats on the back from me. Because for me, this was an issue that, of course, if you do something wrong, if one of your employees did something wrong, that yes, you need to address it. But I am disheartened by the fact that black people even have to experience this type of hyper-policing in order for companies like Starbucks to feel like they should have a training like this. And so yes, they're using this nebulous language of unconscious bias. And I think they're in part using this specific language and not implicit bias, because that language was also used in a lot of the police-related shootings. And so I think they're trying to separate what happened in their store from these other race-related anti-black situations involving the police. Right. So I think they're trying to be very strategic here, and it's a lot of corporate speak. And so I'm not convinced that they have a real plan, even though they've outlined one on their website, to really affect long-term change. So we'll see.
Well, so there are a couple of things. I think it's much different if a company decides to do something like this than, for example, other individuals who have called the police on African Americans for doing seemingly mundane tasks, you know, barbecuing or studying in a dorm where they're a student, right? I think what may be happening here is that a corporation decides to do something like this because if an employee engages in this type of behavior, then legally they can fire them. They can say, look, you've been trained on how to deal with situations like this. You clearly haven't followed corporate protocol. You're out of here. And that is at least something. Would you agree?
Well, I mean, it is something, right? They've definitely checked off all of the boxes for crisis management.
And they can say, if you do this, we have firm legal footing to discipline you. Whereas before, it's a little harder. Somebody can say, well, I didn't know, you know, I was always told to keep, in the case of Starbucks, I was always told to keep what I thought were riffraff, if that's the argument, right, out of the store, and I can define who that is. The company is saying, no, you can't.
But actually, they are still allowing people, even in the case where they say everyone can come in and use the restroom, they're still saying, but our employees have the right to call the police if they feel like someone's in danger, and that's the problem. It's like, how do you correct for what somebody identifies as this danger. Because for this manager, seeing somebody come in with what they call in the hood, like a Philly beard and a hoodie and twisted hairstyles, you know, for them that's, oh wow, you don't belong here. Whereas that same hoodie, if we were in Silicon Valley, you could be read as a tech billionaire genius, right? But so still it means that Starbucks employees have some space to and latitude to interpret the policy. And even with the sitting in, I think like sitting in and waiting to purchase something, like this is not something that we've seen be implemented equally across Starbucks stores either. So I'm curious to see like what will happen long term when yes, you shut down more than 8,000 stores for this training, but how will this still be implemented locally? Even if corporate lays out this very elaborate vision, which they've worked very closely with people like Eric Holder and Brian Stevenson and Sherilyn Ifill to design, how is it still going to affect everyday lives of Black people who come into their stores?
Because you're talking about something that is, you know, part of the fabric of America. Right, and can an afternoon of training undo that? And you know, Philadelphia has a large African American population. People are doctors and lawyers and aspiring business young men and students, and you know, people that are Black and white and other races intermix all the time. If you're not aware of how other cultures are living and experiencing America and you're working with them and side by side, then I don't know how an afternoon is going to change your perspective.
Right. I definitely think that this afternoon is about as symbolic as the $1 payment, the settlement with the city of Philadelphia, right? This is something that, again, is a public performance because largely we have to remember that, as you said, Philadelphia is a very diverse city, and it's a city that has always had a very active Black activist community. A lot of the responses we're seeing from Starbucks is due to on-the-ground activism by activists in Philly who are also connected to a national network of Black activists. We can look at any point of history in American history and see that there were activists mobilized in Philadelphia around some of our greatest social justice issues. And so in this case, it's the Philly people, the Philly community that has come out to say, you know, we will not stand for this, you know, and so I know the Starbucks senior leadership has said that this day will not be the only step, but just like they've kept much of the details about what will happen during this training secret, we don't know what will happen after this moment.
It is, well, I mean, it is important, and what you're saying is right, and what you're also saying is important to note, which is that this is a very complicated issue. In some cases, this could be unconscious racial bias. People don't realize that they're saying or doing something. You know, I've had many people say to me, you know, my son married an African-American person, and I'm not, you know, you hear that a lot. I'm not racist because I have Black people in my family, or I have Asians in my family, or Hispanic people in my family. But then when they're out interacting with other people around the world, they do and they say things that show that there is some kind of an unconscious racial bias that they have that they may not even be aware of. And that one day of training is not going to do away with that. On the other hand, though, a corporation should be, I think, applauded for at least recognizing that this is a problem, as opposed to 30 years ago where they would have just moved on with business. They would have said, we're really sorry, maybe quietly paid them off to, you know, go away, or, you know,
30 years ago, maybe even right now. And you do have 175,000 employees, and if they can have an impact on the way those employees view race and view the way different races experience America, then, you know, one person affects 10 other people, and who knows, we can really sort of see a change. You know, Vlad talked about some of these issues that that's been popping up on social media, some of these issues where police are being called on African Americans for essentially doing mundane things, barbecuing, just being Black. Being themselves. Breathing, yeah. And, you know, we were talking a little bit about some of the reaction to some of them lately has been to sort of counteract it with humor. After the outrage, there's been sort of memes and funny little songs and jokes being made. And in a way, I think it sort of relieves the pressure. But I wanted to get your take on people kind of creating memes and laughing about these situations, because when you call the police on someone, I mean, that situation can go from 0 to 100, you know, in no time.
Exactly. So we've seen the case with a group of Black folks who were leaving the Airbnb. the police were called on them. I think we get that story in large part because one of the women was related to Bob Marley, and so that's a name that's recognizable. We see the Yale graduate student who's asleep in the study area, the common area of a dorm, and the police, a woman calls the police on her. And so, yeah, I think that there are different types of humor related to this. I think Black Twitter does a great job of giving the biting social commentary that has a humorous edge on it, but that is not making light of or diminishing these issues, but instead is using humor in the way that our best comedians, our best socially conscious comedians have done it. But I think that that's different than seeing humor become a part of the script and how we respond to these issues, you know, which is saying, like, if someone is harassed or policed, and then we see a corporation roll out all of the fancy, glittery, you know, crisis management pieces, and then we all say, oh, okay, and this is how this episode ends, right? We all just kind of say, ha ha, and we move past it. There's a difference between that and really incisive, you know, humorous critique as a way to critique hyper-policing, capitalism, anti-Black sentiment, etc.
Well, Tanisha Ford, Dr. Tanisha
Always
Ford.
great to have you.
Can't
so
forget the doctor.
interesting.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so great.